Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of The Art of Procurement. I'm Philip Heidson, the host of the show, and the topic of today's conversation is going to be how we can identify cost savings in the software space. I've talked software before. You might actually recall a conversation I had with Randy Roth of Seprio a couple of months ago, where Randy shared some of the differences in contracting between Onpremise and SAS solutions, and also how to negotiate with some of the giants of the software industry. But today we're actually going to focus on some actions and specifically how to identify savings opportunities across your entire portfolio of software suppliers. When I say cost savings as well, I don't really mean getting a better rate, but partnering with IT to identify where you're actually spending on software that you don't need to, or perhaps another example would be paying maintenance where you shouldn't be. It's really what are some of the other ways that go beyond the rate to help us save some money. My guest to take us on this journey is Mohammed Faridy of OneView, and I met Mohammed through a mutual acquaintance. Mohammed is actually an experienced technology sourcing consultant and a practitioner. But before we start, I mentioned last week that I had problems with my mic on 3 different shows that I recorded in the same day. This is the second of those shows. However, I did bring in a specialist audio engineer to work his magic on my voice track, so I hope it doesn't detract from your enjoyment of the conversation today. So that being said, let me go into my first question. And the first question that I asked Mohammed was related to his background. I asked him, how did an aircraft mechanic by training actually get into procurement?
When I was young, when I was in high school, my father passed away. So I, instead of going to university like my other classmates, I actually dropped out in my senior year and I started working full time. And after a few years, my mom, who really wanted me to get a higher education, to appease her, I signed up for a certification course in Chicago for aviation maintenance. It's in the U.S. It's called the Airframe and Power Plant License. And along with that, you get a 2-year college degree. So I did that. I completed it, and I am a licensed airframe and power plant mechanic. I also got married during that time. Right. And what I realized when I graduated was when we're young, we make hasty choices. And I didn't want to turn wrenches for a living.
Right.
So I made a few other life decisions, some good, some bad, but all leading me towards, the final goal. I did retail for several years and decided that was not for me either. And I started working on an IT help desk. We were in New Jersey at the time. I landed on an IT help desk for procurement. So my employer had an outsourced agreement with one of the big telcos in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And it was a procurement help desk. Customers were calling, clients were calling and asking, where's my laptop? I ordered a monitor. How do I plug in my mouse? Things like that. Yeah. But while I was working there, I got to know the server procurement team. And I started doing work in the server procurement side. Then I started learning about networking, switches, and things like that, Cisco gear. And I was doing contract work. And it's one of the things I've found in my career. It really is about getting to know people and networking with people. Yeah. I was doing a contract for Merrill Lynch in New Jersey, and I used to see a lady at the coffee shop, and we would chat. She was a lawyer for Merrill Lynch. My contract ended January 2000, so Y2K, nobody's hiring. Mm-hmm. And this lady called me out of the blue. She had went to Solomon Smith Barney, which then became Citibank. Yeah. And she said, hey, I'm over here at Solomon Smith Barney, and I'm temporarily managing the procurement department. I'm looking for somebody. Would you be interested in coming to work for me in New York City? So fantastic. So I started to work for her. Again, basic purchasing, getting quotes, cutting POs. But I would ask her a lot of questions about contract language. So I would ask her, what is an indemnity? What does liability really mean? She saw I had an interest in it, so we came up with an interesting arrangement. Her husband, who was an attorney in Long Island, he was having trouble always. He was losing files on his computer. So I became his personal help desk. Right. 7 days a week, he had my cell phone number. He would call me, and he would ask me questions about how to fix his computer or find his files. And in return, this lady, Jane, she would let me sit in on her negotiations and just listen and take notes. And then we'd go for lunch or coffee afterwards, and I'd ask her questions. And after a while, she thought I had an aptitude for negotiation. So she actually recommended me to the SVP at Citibank for software contracts. Mm-hmm. So I started working for this gentleman, and then he kind of took me under his wing, sent me to training, mentored me. He continues to mentor me. He's almost retired now. He's in Long Island. And that's how I fell into procurement. And it's amazing how much you learn from other areas of your profession. So I mean, I learned things in sales that I use today when I negotiate. I learned things about being a mechanic that help me with contract management. There's certain skill set, these soft skills, that I even tell the folks that work for me now. So everything's a tool. You got to put it in your tool belt because you'll need it at some point in your life.
Yeah, it's such a great example of the power of a mentor as well, of kind of finding those people in your life who actually, you can build that relationship with, and, it's kind of a two-way street. I always think about what value am I providing for somebody who may want, or who I'm maybe fortunate enough to count on as a mentor. But those relationships are just so invaluable.
Yeah, and you have to nurture them.
Yeah. And
also, I found in my career that you have to take some bold steps to create those relationships. Yeah. If I hadn't said hello to Jane at a coffee shop at Merrill Lynch, I would never have gotten the job at Salomon Smith Barney and then at Citibank. And even at Citibank, I mean, the gentleman that I worked for is a really interesting story. Jane recommended me to him. He hired me because Jane had recommended me. But my first 2 weeks working for this gentleman, and I joke with him about it now, we're actually very good friends, but my first 2 weeks, he wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't make eye contact. I would see him on the train when we would be riding in together. I'd say hello, and he would just look away. Or he would grunt. He wasn't giving me any work to do. And 2 weeks in, I was besides myself. I didn't know what I was going to do. So my cubicle used to be outside. He had a big corner office, and it was right outside his office. And I knew he ate his lunch at his desk every day. He was very antisocial would be the right word for it. So one day he walked out of his office. I walked in. I grabbed his half-eaten sandwich. I brought it back and put it on my desk. And then I waited for him to come back to his office. He came in, saw his sandwich was missing, and he was standing in his doorway looking around, and he caught me looking back at him.
Right.
So he walked over to me, and he looked over, and he said, is that my sandwich? And I said, yeah, that's your sandwich. And he said, what the expletive is my sandwich doing on your desk? Yeah. So I said, well, Ted, I've been working for you for 2 weeks. You won't give me work to do. You're not training me. You don't even say hello or make eye contact. So I figured at this point, you're either going to fire me or I'm going to quit.
Right.
So this was my last kick at the can to see if we could work together. He laughed so loud that other managers came out of their office because they'd never heard him laugh before. So he grabbed his sandwich, told me to get my lunch and meet him in his office. And from that point on, I became kind of his right-hand man. Right. Other employees would say, hey, how come you get to eat lunch with Ted? I said, well, sometimes you have to put yourself out there. It's risky.
Yeah.
Right? But the rewards are just as, I stole his sandwich.
So fast forward now, what is it that, how are you spending your days today? I know that you set up a few years ago, OneView. And, we spoke a little bit off mic, but I thought that it'd be useful just for the purposes of the audience to get to know you a little bit more. If you could just explain a little bit about what it is that you do today.
Sure. So, I was in the industry for almost 20 years, in various levels of procurement, contract management. And then one day, about almost 8 years ago, I was a director at a company, and I was dealing with some consultants that we had brought in to help with contract negotiations, contract management, basic procurement stuff. And I said to myself, I can do this so much better. Most of the time, I'm training these consultants because they actually don't know anything about procurement. The only reason I can't do it is because I've got staff and I've got other corporate responsibilities. I'd rather do this on my own. So I started first a consulting firm, and we started doing consulting. So me and a couple of my colleagues got together, and we were guns for hire for organizations that are looking to bring somebody in to help with negotiations or some procurement function. While I was doing that, I realized, and it's something I'd realized a long time ago, most organizations have a hard time managing their contracts. And the reason for that is because the tools that are out there available to them, they're on two ends of the spectrum. Either you have something really complicated like an ERP system, which is very hard to use. So corporations buy them, employees don't use them. Yeah. And on the other end of the spectrum, they'll make it up. So, SharePoint and Excel seems to be the standard.
Right.
So we decided to develop a very simple cloud-based contract management solution that eliminates the need for our clients to do any type of data entry. They just drag and drop their contracts in. They get parsed, information's extracted, they can find them and set up their alerts.
Right. So I know that once you have those contracts loaded into OneView, one of the things that you do today, and you talked a little bit about consulting before, is then help organizations actually review those contracts to determine if there's any savings opportunities, particularly with software agreements, I think. And I wondered, as you do that, what are some of the things you look for to determine whether there actually are any cost savings opportunities available in those agreements?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you have, in general, the general statement is when you have your data organized, it's very interesting the things that you see in the data. It could be contracts, it could be IT, it could be your personal bank account. So once you actually can see the data in an organized fashion, then you start to see certain patterns. And software contracts are no different. I've found that one of the biggest challenges organizations have with finding cost savings in their software agreements is they don't know where their software agreements are.
Yeah.
And if they don't know where they are, then they don't know what they say. So something as simple as terminating a software agreement is a huge cost savings opportunity. We've done a lot of work for organizations where we will go in and we have a process by which we try to determine cost savings. And in that process, we'll find that there is software that they're paying for year over year on annual maintenance or a subscription fee, but we don't actually see it being deployed or used in the organization.
Yeah.
And when we ask the question, well, why don't you just terminate the agreement? The reality is they don't know if they can. They can't find their contract, so they don't know what their termination rights are.
Yeah.
They don't know if they have a termination for convenience. So rather than get caught in a compliance or spend the time finding the contract, they just continue to pay year over year. And it's not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. As an industry overall, the software industry makes hundreds of millions of dollars every year in payments they receive for software that's not being used. And I don't believe that that's an overstatement at all.
Right. No, I think just from personal experience, you can understand that. Even in our small business here, I think that happens. So extrapolate that hundreds of thousands of times over. It makes sense to me completely that happens, because you would kind of lose oversight of exactly what you paid for. And especially with SaaS, where you're paying for it on a subscription model, or maybe it's an annual retainer or whatever it may be, that those amounts may seem small on their own, but they add up and you kind of lose track of it. I think that's sometimes what the software providers want, which is why they have those kind of agreements in place. So you do kind of sign up and forget.
Well, I'll give you not an extreme example, but a really good example of how software vendors use an on-premise license and SaaS licenses to get clients to overpay. We had a client we were doing some work for as part of a post-merger integration. So our client actually bought another company. Yeah. And so we were going in and reviewing the contracts and the software agreements that they were inheriting. And we found an agreement for a piece of software that the company that was acquired, they had bought this software. It was on-premise license. So on-premise being, it was a server-based software that you install in the servers and people use. And it was finance software. And they had paid $250,000 for this software. Right. And they were paying $50,000 a year in maintenance. They had already paid 3 years. They did a 7-year deal. So they had another 4 years of payments left. Yeah. But when we went and we talked to the finance team and said, okay, are you still using this? Because we don't actually see it deployed on the servers. Where did you install it and who's using it? The accounting team said, well, the supplier actually came out with a SaaS version of the same software that works much better for us. Right. So we signed up for that subscription.
Wow. And so a few months out.
And they were paying for both, and no, because the accounting team hadn't told the IT team.
Yeah.
IT team didn't install it. The invoices would come into accounts payable. There was a purchase order. Their company was based on a two-way match. So invoice matches PO, pay the invoice.
Yeah.
But nobody bothered to ask, are you actually using this? And it took quite a bit of work for my team to actually get our client out of that agreement when we did the assignment.
So how does a supplier, and maybe in this actual case, how do they react to that? Is it like, oh, hands up, you've caught me, which obviously isn't very good from a relationship perspective because it shows that they know they're taking advantage of you, or do they hide behind complexity and different agreements and different teams and, kind of play a bit of a blind eye to it?
It was a little bit of both because what had happened was the client hadn't just purchased this one piece of software for $250,000. Their actual acquisition with that supplier was over $1 million for a bunch of different things. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of wrapped into it.
Right.
And I believe to this day the supplier wrapped it into it because they were having side conversations with the accounting team and they knew they were going to get them into the SaaS version.
Yeah.
And this was just a bonus. So at first, it was about the assignment. So they said, well, sorry, this contract, it was signed. It's a 7-year agreement, and there was no termination for convenience. Mm-hmm. Sorry, there was no partial termination for convenience. So the supplier said, well, if you terminate the contract, you terminate everything, and then you're going to have to rebuy the stuff you are actually using.
Right.
Or you continue to pay maintenance on it. So at first it was, well, it's very complex and it's all kind of linked together. When we decoupled it, then it was a shrugging of the shoulders to say, well, we can't help it if the client buys one thing and then buys something else that does the exact same thing. It's not our responsibility, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So it was a tough situation, but there's always a way out of these tough situations. And I tell my team all the time, and we advise our clients as well, right? Before you get into the conversation with the supplier, regardless of what it's about, whether it's you're renewing something or you're doing a new deal, do your homework.
Right.
Get all of the facts and figure out what is your leverage.
Yeah.
There's at the Harvard negotiation program, they teach you this concept of Batna. And all my guys know what that is, and that's the first thing we do.
Right.
What are our alternatives? Yeah. Let's put everything on the table and quantify it.
Yeah. Making it up as you go along.
Sure. Yeah. And in this particular case, we did our research and we found out that our client, who was the acquirer of this new company, they had something as well that could replace the existing tool, and the subscription agreement you could terminate because it was a SaaS subscription. Right. You could terminate any time. Right. So we went back to the supplier and said, listen, if you don't kill the maintenance on this unused product and give a refund, we'll continue to pay the maintenance, but we're going to kill the subscription.
Yeah.
And in a few years, you're going to get zero revenue out of this client versus what you're getting now. And suddenly the tune changed, right? And they were more willing to have a discussion.
When you're looking at software agreements, do you find that typically the cost-saving opportunities are more because of things that you're paying for that you haven't deployed, or where you're paying maintenance where you shouldn't be? It's kind of it's not going in there and trying to find the next 3, 5, 10% cost reduction. It's more optimizing what you're actually using and not paying for things that you don't really use. Is that where the money is, for the want of a better word, in software?
I believe so. I believe that's one of the main reasons why we found that software is where the opportunity for cost savings exists the most. The other reason is software itself. Software licensing is very complicated, and software companies. And I can say this because I have my own software company. Right. So software companies do spend a lot of time thinking of ways to create licensing models. The bigger software companies will create licensing models that are so complicated that they're designed to extract more revenue out of a client. Yeah. And most organizations don't have the in-house expertise in software procurement, so they just rely on whatever the software supplier is telling them as gospel. So, and in mainframe, this is exponentially higher than anywhere else. So if we are talking to a client that has any type of mainframe licensing, that without even looking at what they're using or how much they're paying, I put my cards on the table and I say, I could probably find you $1 million to $2 million in cost savings. Yeah. And it's usually, their eyes get wide and they're like, well, you don't even know what we're using. Right. Like, I don't have to. If you're using mainframe and you've outsourced it, then I know I can find you savings. Yeah. And I always do.
So what are some of the ways they use then to try and bring complexity? So if you're looking at a software agreement, and you're a relatively untrained eye in software specifically, what are some of the things to look for? Maybe some of the red flags that suggest, hey, there's opportunity here.
Sure. So putting mainframe aside for a second, because that's a whole other animal. On the distributed side, one of the things to look for in software licensing models is the core or CPU or server-based licensing model. So there are some big software suppliers out there. I won't mention their names, but they like to license their product by core. So a server has a CPU, and on the CPU, the chip could be a single core, dual core. Now they have quad core chips. And the suppliers are now asking customers to license at the core level. Where the complexity comes in is if I have a machine with 8 cores and I'm only using 2 of those to actually run the software that I've licensed, do I have to buy a license for all 8 cores or just 2 cores? Sometimes you have to buy it for all 8. Sometimes you can do it for 2. The other complexity comes in when it's a developer license versus a test license versus a production license. So you may only need to license 2 cores on a development license, but all 8 for prod. And then on top of that, you add in virtualization. So this is a big thing with a lot of organizations, and it makes sense. Why have 10 physical machines when I can have 2 physical machines and have 50 virtual machines running off of those 2 physical machines? Well, a lot of clients, what they don't understand or what they don't calculate in is that some of these bigger software suppliers, they require you to license every core on a machine, whether physical or virtual. And that gets them into some serious compliance issues. I mean, we had a client who they were licensing a product in a virtualized environment that it had to be licensed for every core, physical or virtual. They didn't know that or chose to ignore it, and they were licensing like crazy. And the supplier came in and said, your implementation that you have of a server farm of only 8 servers, you have a $70 million software implementation, and the CFO almost had a heart attack, right? Because the tech team just decided, well, every machine gets the software.
So this would be for, and I'm a little bit, IT is probably the one category that I have less experience than others. So I'm trying to understand a little bit of this as well in my mind, especially when you talk about cores. Is this for products or for software that is enterprise-wide, that's not necessarily determined by the number of users? It's just something as an organization you need to maybe run some back-end?
Correct. Like database.
Yeah.
A database is the best example.
Okay.
So the big ones out there is Oracle, SQL, and SAP.
Yeah.
And I could probably throw a stone out my window and hit a company that has compliance issues with Oracle, SAP, or Microsoft.
Yeah.
And it's for that reason.
Okay.
The tech guys, they're responsible for making sure, the IT is running well and everybody's happy, but they don't necessarily get into the weeds of understanding how the product is actually licensed. And part of that has to do with they don't have access to the contracts.
Yeah.
Nobody explained it to them.
From a procurement perspective, is there something we can do to get visibility into that? Because I'm just imagining how, as you say, the tech guys just want to make sure that the product works. And, from a procurement perspective, when I think about volumes and demand management, it doesn't seem like there's a great deal of transparency into what is actually used, which, creates this perfect storm, which enables essentially the software provider to deploy as much as they possibly can of a particular software, and then come to procurement later and say, hey, do you know that your guys are using it here, 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 and here, and so here's the bill. And at that point, you don't really have a great place to go because you're already using it. So how can you bring some transparency to that so you can keep abreast of what is actually being used, where is it being used?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's a challenge. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons it's a challenge, as I said earlier, it's because unfortunately a lot of organizations don't have the in-house expertise within their procurement department. IT procurement, particularly software procurement, is not like other categories of procurement. Every category has its nuance. Yeah. But IT, you almost have to be an IT person wearing a procurement hat. Mm-hmm. And I say that cautiously because a lot of organizations choose to just give somebody in IT the role of the procurement person for their stuff, which is not the right thing to do either, because procurement professionals have very specific training. They learn how to do things in a certain way, the right way to do procurement. IT people don't know how to do that. Yeah. The only way to bridge the gap, there's 2 ways that I know of. Either you hire somebody, and they cost money. So somebody who's an expert in software procurement, and there's some good ones out there. Or you bring in a third-party consultant to help you do an analysis and do some level setting so that you can carry on with software procurement without necessarily having to have that in-house expertise. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it done both ways.
So when you come into a client, obviously you're there to really get under the weeds to see where cost savings may exist, but also to try and understand when there's potential cost savings, what they could look like so that you could start putting together a wave plan or a priority list. Is there a process that you use to actually quantify the cost savings, or is it perhaps a process that a listener could go through that would help them do the same?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a process, and when we meet with our clients, we give them the process up front. because I believe that if you can do it yourself, you should do it yourself. And we only assist when and where the client wants us to assist, and depending on how much they want us to assist. Sometimes we'll serve in an advisory role. Sometimes we'll roll up our sleeves and sit with them and do the work. But our process it's a simple process. The first thing we ask the client is to provide us with a data dump of all of the software running in their environment. And clients can do this using, they usually have asset management tools that help deploy the software, like an Altiris or a FlexNet, and there's a bunch of them out there. So we ask them to run the scan, get a list of every piece of software that's running in the environment, and that list usually that gives, the name of the software manufacturer, the version, how many instances are running, where it's running. We ask for that data. We also ask them to provide us with their software or IT budget for the previous year, current year, and the following year. We ask them for their technology roadmap, if they have one, for the next 3 to 5 years. And then we set up an instance of OneView for them. And we ask them to upload all of the contracts related to that software that they have running in their environment into OneView, along with the associated POs and invoices for those contracts. And then we do some analysis. And this is the part where, because a lot of organizations don't have the in-house expertise, this is where we can really provide assistance. Yeah. Because not only do we have the IT procurement expertise, we have on our team IT expertise. So the first thing we do is we do an analysis, and we create what's called a function map. Mm-hmm. And this is very helpful. By example, we just did a presentation for one of our clients. We completed the analysis, and we had the CFO, the CIO, and the procurement director in the room while we were doing the presentation. And the CFO's challenge was, he's basically signing the check for all of this expenditure. He doesn't understand what he's buying. Yeah. So in the function map, we were able to show him, okay, under the database function, you have 6 different databases deployed in your environment, which is interesting because do you really need SQL, SAP, and Oracle plus 3 other databases running in your environment? Or under the asset management function, you have Altiris and FlexNet running in your environment, 2 very expensive tools that do essentially the same thing. So this starts to create opportunities for optimization, right? 2 expensive tools, maybe you can find a way to whittle it down to 1 if you don't already have that on your roadmap. And in this particular case, they didn't. Yeah. So we asked the question, are you planning on using both? And, it caused them to think about that. Then when we did the analysis of their technology budget, we start to see some very interesting things. And clients can do this themselves. You look at your technology budget, and we saw that there was a product they had bought last year, a very expensive product. They paid about $500,000 for it, but we did not see maintenance budgeted for that product in the current year or the next year. So that was a miss on their part. Conversely, we saw some products that were in the technology budget. It had been paid for last year. They had it in the budget for this year and next year. But when we looked at the data dump, we didn't see the products deployed anywhere in the environment. Yeah. So this was a case of they were paying for something they weren't using, right? And then finally, when we looked at the contracts they uploaded into OneView, one of the first things that I noticed was this particular client, based on the data dump, had 150 unique vendors that they were using for different pieces of software, but they only uploaded 30 contracts. Right. That is a huge alarm bells went off, right? So that was step 1 is where are your contracts? And do you have contracts? And when we started to dig further into that, what we found was a lot of the software that was being deployed, they weren't doing contracts with the suppliers. They were just going off of whatever agreement the supplier had on their website, or they have these things called click wrap agreements. When you install the software, you get that little notice saying, do you accept the terms and conditions?
Right.
Well, if you read into those terms and conditions, and this is where the cost savings opportunities came into play, right? There were things in those agreements that were causing them to pay more than they should. And something very simple like payment terms.
Mm-hmm.
I know we had talked earlier about payment terms. I mean, the industry standard payment terms for most suppliers is 30 to 45 days, net 30 to net 45. They were under payment terms that were net 10, net 15, net 20.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do the time value of money calculation, that's a lot of money going out your door that doesn't have to.
Yeah.
Simply because they weren't actually negotiating their contracts. So in doing this exercise, what we did was out of their 150 vendors, we did an analysis just to show them on 6 suppliers. And what we found was very interesting. One of the suppliers, we found they had been paying a subscription fee annually. And then back in 2013, somebody in the IT department decided to do a 2-year renewal because this was standard software for them. They were going to use it for years and years. Mm-hmm. So they did a 2-year renewal, and they were proud of the fact that they were able to get a 5% discount on a $300,000 renewal.
Right.
Which isn't much.
Right.
But what was more interesting was that in 2015, they did another 2-year renewal, and their price went up by 10%.
Right. Mm-hmm.
In another case, they had a supplier who was charging them 5% increases year over year. But when we looked at their contract, it actually had a cap of lesser of 3% or CPI on annual increases. So they were paying about 2% more than they should have year over year. So just on those 7 suppliers, we were able to find approximately $100,000 in potential cost savings and cost avoidance just for this year, so the next 4 months. Now you multiply that by 150 vendors, and you can start to see where the opportunities are.
You know, in a process like that, where do you draw the line in terms of, you know, the deep dive into contracts? Is it the typical procurement, you know, the 80-20 Pareto, or in software, is there a different way that you look at things in terms of where the opportunities may be?
Well, it's a combination of things. We try to look at everything holistically. So we look at their IT budget, and we definitely look at, well, who are the suppliers you're spending the most with? But then we layer in the technology roadmap and try to see, well, okay, who are the suppliers that you're going to continue to do business with? You may be spending a lot of money with one supplier, but if they're not on your roadmap after 2 years, we're not going to focus as much on them as we will on some of the longer term ones. If you have somebody who's a long-term supplier, maybe we do multi-year renewals. Maybe we bring them in and renegotiate. Yeah. The other thing that we do is we look at, well, your supplier that you're buying X from, what else do they do?
Yeah.
What other products do they have? And that's where that function map comes into play. Well, if I have a supplier that is only supplying one product, but they have products that also can assist in other functions, then maybe it's a conversation worth having with the IT team to say, could this supplier also provide products for these other functions? And then we can use economies of scale to bring the overall price down.
Yeah, and a more strategic conversation with that supplier rather than just being tactical around one particular specific engagement or agreement.
Yeah, and that having that conversation with IT, for all the procurement folks that are listening, when you have that conversation at that level with IT, you will win the respect of the IT department. Because then they will look at you as somebody who knows what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, you're helping them think about, again, more holistically. You're looking at things not on an individual deal perspective, but, you know, what's their entire technology stack, and how can we optimize, you know, the value of the dollar and putting all that together. Yeah. You mentioned earlier about, you know, bringing in suppliers to negotiate with them. And, you know, I think that's pretty natural. We do that at the end of an engagement, also at the end of a contract. But what about if the renewal date isn't coming up yet? You've identified an opportunity, but there's still a 2, 3, 4 years. You mentioned earlier a 7-year deal. You know, there's still years outstanding on an engagement. How do you bring that supplier in to have a conversation around their price? when on the face of it, you don't really there isn't the leverage there to do so?
Yeah, it really comes back to the Batna exercise, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So, and you have to layer in all the pieces of information. So when we do our process, it's a very in-depth process. At the end of it, we know what all of the software is that's running in the environment. We know what it does by function.
Yeah.
We know historically what's been paid for it and what they're going to continue paying for it. We know where it is on the technology roadmap. And we know what the contract says. When we put all of that information into the pot and stir it around, we can create leverage in certain areas. Function is one of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
If I have a supplier and if I look at it holistically and I say, you know what, we're paying too much, or these terms are not the right terms for our client. Okay, well, let's look at everything else. Is there something else out there that can replace them?
Yeah.
Are they on the long-term roadmap? Can we go and negotiate a longer term deal?
Yeah.
Sometimes, and this is one where that often gets missed. A lot of strategic software agreements have SLAs. They have service level agreements. So the question I ask is, are they being enforced?
Right.
Is the supplier actually meeting your service levels?
Yeah.
And if not, what does your contract say about your recourse for not meeting service levels? Most clients will not act on those SLA penalties.
Right.
We will. So
Right.
so that's an area where we'll go back, and it's funny because a lot of times the suppliers are taken aback. What you want to talk about SLAs? Well, yeah, because it's in the contract.
Right.
Just because nobody's talked to you about it in 3 years doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Why don't you come in and let's talk about exactly what you do for us?
Yeah.
There was a supplier we were doing work for a client, and the client had a support agreement with the supplier, and it was a long-term agreement. And again, it was one of these things where we were just looking for areas for cost savings. So I started looking at the arrangement, and basically what the supplier was doing was it was for networking equipment. The supplier had a support arrangement where they set up a help desk, and our client would call the supplier whenever one of these switches would go bad. But when I dug into it, what I found was what the supplier was doing was they would take a call from the customer, they would log the call, open a ticket, and immediately send it to the vendor. In this case, it was Hitachi.
Yeah.
To solve the call.
Yeah.
So I brought the supplier in and I asked them, I said, explain to me or give me an example of a situation where our client called you for support and you resolved it without it going to Hitachi. They couldn't think of one. So I said, well, I think we should renegotiate the support plan that we have. If all you're doing is taking notes for us, maybe we want that.
Right.
But we're not going to pay you gold support for opening a ticket.
Yeah.
And so that's just an example of how you can actually find ways to renegotiate with your suppliers, even though you may not be coming up for some kind of a renewal event.
Yeah, so it's not as black and white as it may seem. Once you start doing some digging and looking for areas which would allow you to at least reopen the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, and it does require work.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want anybody to think that, it's easy to find savings because there's so much opportunity for savings in software agreements. It's not easy, but the rewards are much greater because there is a lot more opportunity.
Yeah. Mohammed, I know that it's coming up on time to wrap up today's conversation. I just had one final question that I know that you're obviously working with a lot of clients. You see a lot of different situations, and I'm sure a lot of very similar situations when you step into a client for the first time. I just wonder if you could share with listeners what's a common mistake that you often see clients or prospects make, because that would really give, I think, an action item for folks who are listening who may have responsibility for software spend to go and look with their own critical eyes to see if perhaps something that they may be doing?
Yeah. So the number one problem that we see with our clients when we go in is there's no centralized repository for their contracts, combined with managing renewals on a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. It's a recipe for disaster. Right. I've not seen it work well ever. And the problems that it causes it's incredible how many organizations go down this rat hole. We're dealing with a client here in Canada. It's one of the bigger hospitals here. And we were in a discussion with their VP of Medical Services. So in Canada, and I think it's the same in the US, doctors are actually independent contractors. They're not employees of the hospital. So they all have contracts with the hospital. Well, this VP of Medical Services, who was responsible for the 400 plus doctors working in the hospital, was managing their contracts on a spreadsheet. Wow. And he was constantly falling behind on renewing contracts. Yeah. So now you think about it, you've got medical practitioners in a hospital working on patients who don't have a valid contract and all of the insurance and liabilities and indemnities that come with it. So if there was one thing that I would point to, it would be this, the contracts all over the place and then trying to manage their renewals on a spreadsheet is probably the biggest issue that I see in organizations. And with software, it's exponentially greater. Yeah, it's kind of understanding where you already stand so you can actually do something about it. But if you don't, then you're kind of running around like, putting out fires, but without any kind of strategic, bigger picture perspective. Right. And when you do that, then you're regarded by the rest of the organization as somebody that just runs around and puts out fires. Right, exactly. So, Mohammed, one very last question, and I always say this is the easy one. If listeners are interested in just learning a little bit more about OneView and actually just contacting you to continue the conversation, where would be a good place for them to go and find out a little bit more and to connect directly with you? Yeah, they can visit us at our website, www.oneviewnow.com. Yeah. There's a wealth of information. We do a lot of small training videos, and we've written some articles on this topic that are all on there. And from that website, they can contact us or they can email us at info@oneviewnow.com. And we'd love to talk to people, even if it's not to help them, but just to learn what they're doing to get over some of these issues, because it's a learning process for us as well. Yeah, it's the power of the ecosystem, this procurement community of helping each other, I think, come up with new, interesting, successful, efficient ways of solving what perhaps age-old problems that really help us elevate the role of the profession and the impact that we can have. And that's what we're all about here as well. So really appreciate you spending the time with me today, Mohammed. I will include the contact details. I include the OneView website on the show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/OneView. That's artofprocurement.com/OneView. So one last time, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.